Hey everybody, welcome back to History Student Reacts. Today we'll be watching Why Didn't the USA Annex All of Mexico in 1848 by History Matters. We're doing a bit of a shorter one today. This video is only 3 minutes long. I thought this would be an interesting one. I haven't seen much of History Matters content in the past, but I thought this was an interesting topic. We don't do too much American history on this channel, and I'd like to bring more of that in. So I'm excited to get into this one. If you guys end up enjoying this video, I would appreciate it if you would check out my Patreon, which is linked down below. And without any further ado, let's get into this reaction.
In 1848, after defeating Mexico in a war, the United States annexed these territories from it. And there were many notable individuals in the US that weren't happy at simply taking these lands. In fact, they wanted to manifest destiny the entirety of Mexico.
Oh yes, and for those that are unaware, Manifest Destiny was this American idea that the American people, the American nation, was sort of destined, in a way, to expand westwards and take all the lands from sea to shining sea, from Atlantic to the Pacific. And this idea could be more or less extreme depending on who you talk to. Obviously, if you look at the original 13 colonies, America has expanded quite a far way. But a lot of people thought that the United States should take over the entire North American continent. Canada, Mexico. Then, when we got from the Atlantic to the Pacific, a lot of people wanted us to expand overseas. Hawaii, Puerto Rico, the Philippines, Cuba, countries that, like Hawaii, we either annexed into the Union or made into colonies, or like Cuba made into pseudo-colonies. So there was a lot of this expansionist sentiment, and a lot of it had an almost religious aspect to it. Americans were, destined. It was their God-given right to expand into this territory, which, of course, was already inhabited by other groups of people, but that never stopped an American, huh?
Of course, they never did, but given how thoroughly the US won the war, this does raise a question. Why didn't the US take all of Mexico?
Sure, we ended up taking a lot of Mexico's territory. I believe it was about a third of Mexican territory, but we didn't take all of it, and that's what this video is about, of course.
So the war started after the US annexed Texas, and the new borders between the United States and Mexico became unclear.
Yes, well, in the mid-1830s, Texas had its own sort of war of independence against Mexico, because a lot of Anglo-Americans, white Americans, had been moving to Texas, and they wanted to do their own thing. A lot of them, and this ended up being sort of the decisive factor, were slavers, and they wanted to run slave plantations. The Mexican government did not want them to do that. There were some other issues about local autonomy and stuff like that, and so these Texans fought against the Mexican government and the Mexican army, and they managed to win. But the American government at the time, in the 1830s, wasn't yet interested in annexing Texas, though they would 10 years later.
Texans, and thus now the Americans, claimed the border to be here, whereas the Mexicans said it was here. Both sent troops, and after a small skirmish, the US declared war.
And this is what led to the MexicanAmerican War. America would annex Texas in the mid-1840s. America would do a bunch of deliberate provocations of the Mexicans. The American government wanted to frame it as, well, the Mexicans were the aggressors, not us, but that's really not true. The American government, the American military, sort of set out to provoke Mexico through, border patrols and stuff like that. And like they said, the border was very fuzzy after America had annexed Texas, and so it sort of inevitably led to this conflict, which America very much wanted because it wanted to gobble up more Mexican territory.
The Americans won the war handily, and so when it was time to make peace, President James K. Polk had a dilemma. Just how much land should they take? Polk had been elected on a promise to expand the United States territorially. The war with Mexico had been contentious domestically, and there were several areas of disagreement. The first was slavery. Mexico had abolished slavery over a decade before the war. But if territory was taken from it, then its status as either a slave state or a free state wouldn't be clear.
Yeah, this was honestly a big, and I think sort of underrated part of American expansion. I feel like this should be brought up more often. A lot of the motivation for American expansion, grabbing more territory, was the expansion of slavery. And this was one of the reasons the Civil War happened in the first place. When Abraham Lincoln was elected, he didn't say that he would end or abolish slavery. He simply said that he would stop the expansion of slavery. He would not allow slavery to be brought into any new states or new territories. And that led to the Civil War. That shows you how important this was. With the expansion westward, territories like Missouri, Kansas, Nebraska, there was a lot of debate and a lot of political compromises and a lot of real-life violence over whether these new territories, which would become states, should be free states or slave states. And so, the expansion into Mexico's territory was part of that. There were a lot of people, a lot of politicians who were not into the Mexican-American War. They felt it was blatantly imperialist, and they felt like it would just aid unnecessary expansion of, American territory and perhaps of slavery. They didn't want to expand slavery to a bunch of new territory taken from Mexico.
Those in the South wanted a place for the practice to expand to, and if all of Mexico could be turned into slave states, then its future would be secure. Polk was himself pro-slavery, but given that his party had just lost the midterms and the House was now controlled by the Whig Party, he had to compromise. The second issue was that Mexicans were seen as different. There were many US politicians who worried about a sudden influx of Spanish-speaking non-white Catholics upsetting life there.
Yes, because so far, America's expanded into a lot of territory that was occupied by natives, but those natives have either been pushed further west, there's been some attempts at assimilation, or they have been murdered or died from disease. So far, Americans haven't really had to worry about other cultures or other races. But, there are a lot of Mexicans in these territories, and let's be honest, the white Americans of this era are extraordinarily racist. This is sort of the rise of scientific modern racism, so that a lot of them are not really into the idea of adding a bunch of Mexicans into the United States of America. But, expansionist sentiment can sort of overrule that. They're that enthusiastic about further expanding the United States.
The third issue was one of practicality. Polk had promised a quick war against an inferior enemy which would give Americans lots of free land. As the war had dragged on and American troops had to move further and further into Mexico, even occupying its capital, this was no longer the case. As such, incorporating all of Mexico would have led to a long and expensive guerrilla war. Those on the opposing side, including future President James, I guess it's okay if you secede Buchanan, wanted all of Mexico.
Yep, James Buchanan, one of the worst presidents in the Union. If you want to point fingers in terms of blame for the Civil War, obviously you cannot blame any singular individual, but James Buchanan is as good a person to blame as any. He really did, honestly, nothing to prevent the southern states from seceding. He made almost no efforts to stop the breakup of the Union. A pathetic president, honestly. And so, we talk about the concerns with, Mexico today, Mexican territory today. A lot of racist Americans didn't want to bring a bunch of Mexicans into the U.S., but even the Mexican states, or the Mexican territory that we did take, Texas, California, New Mexico, etc., there were a lot of Mexicans there, and of course they ended up not being treated very well. I mean, if you go back 10 years in the 1830s to the Revolution of Texas and the Texas War for Independence, I mean, there were a lot of Mexicans living in that territory. And some of them fought alongside the white Americans in order to fight for Texas independence. And then they were sort of betrayed in a way by these white Texans who then wanted to join the United States. Whereas these, sort of autonomous independent Mexicans, or we sometimes call this group, including both the white Texans and the Mexicans Tejanos, they weren't really interested in being annexed by the U.S. They wanted their own independent republic. So the Mexicans get a really bad deal, whether we are talking about the Mexicans who had to leave the American states, or the Mexicans who were annexed into the United States, or whatever. Obviously, they weren't treated very well by the white Americans.
Their arguments were that the US could handle any insurgency similarly to how they had handled the Native Americans before this. They also argued that all of Mexico should be annexed on financial grounds. Mexico's northern territories were somewhat barren, whereas the south was much more arable and would allow the US Navy access to southern ports, further expanding its reach. It was also believed that annexing all of Mexico would make up for the cost of the war. So why did the lesser annexation plans win out? Well, it was mostly down to a man called Nicholas Trist.
Interesting. I've never heard of this man before. I'm excited to learn about who he was. But it is kind of crazy that, Mexico is its own nation that fought for independence from a European colonizer, just like the United States. I mean, they're on the same playing field, and yet due to racial differences, the Americans feel like they're, so much further above the Mexicans. They have a right to conquer their territory. It's pretty unfortunate. But you can look at the treatment of the Native Americans and, it's not really surprising.
Trist was sent to negotiate a peace settlement and Polk had ordered him to obtain these territories. Trist was largely seen as being too pro-Mexican by the army and so Polk fired him. The problem was that Trist simply ignored him and then negotiated a lesser settlement anyway. He did this because he opposed the war and didn't believe that America could be both a republic and an empire.
Wow, very interesting. I kind of agree with them, but it's kind of interesting you have someone opposed to the war sent to negotiate, who is then fired, but I suppose just keeps doing his job. I guess communication lines were a lot more difficult, and it took a lot longer to communicate from Washington, D.C. to Mexico back in those days. But I'm curious how he managed to keep up these negotiations even after he was technically fired.
He presented this lesser treaty to an unhappy president who just wanted everything over with at this point. Polk had hoped that this lesser treaty would be signed off by a hostile house. This worked, and despite most Americans actually wanting more of, but not all of Mexico, America only annexed this. I hope you enjoyed this episode, and a special thanks to my patrons, James Bisonet, Kelly Moneymaker, Sky Chappelle, Corsho Wall.
Alrighty. Look, we still got a lot of Mexican territory, so it's not like we got off light. We took, like I said, about a third of the territory. I think it's a good thing that Mexico still survived. It's good that the United States didn't eat up all of their territory. But once again, it is kind of interesting that Mexico and the United States were, these post-colonial nations who had freed themselves from their colonial masters, Britain and Spain, and yet now America was becoming an empire of its own. I mean, sometimes we look at the age of American empire as starting in the late early 1900s, with American expansion outside of the continent, onto islands like Cuba and Hawaii, and a lot of islands in the Pacific. But honestly, American empire started far before that, with conflicts with their neighbors over territory, taking territory from the Native Americans, fighting with Mexico over territory. That's what I think, at least. And people like Trist recognized that. He recognized he was witnessing the expansion of American empire, which he thought was at odds with the idea of an American republic, which I would have to agree with. That was an interesting one. I enjoyed that. It was a topic that I knew a bit about, but I feel like I learned a lot as well. If you guys enjoyed this one, I would appreciate it if you would leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and check out my Patreon, which is linked down below. I hope you guys are all having a good day today, and I will see you again next time. Goodbye.